sharing that reading with us. There's some pretty strong words in there and images, but I think the point is made. Don't be a stumbling block, no matter what you do. Let us be in the spirit of prayer. God, as we come here to unpack this message, help us to understand what it means for us today in our lives and how we might best serve you in our world today. In your name we pray, amen. Who are you? What defines your life? Just think about that just for a moment. Where did your identity come from? Your parents, your partner, your spouse, your friends, social media, your job? How would you define yourself? Who are you when no one is looking? What is your authentic self? Your true self? This passage we just heard Peter share with us, more than admonishing the disciples for their short-mindedness and their competitiveness, is actually about identity. The disciples' identity, who they felt they were. Who they were as followers of Jesus. Clearly, they did not like the idea that there was someone else casting out demons and healing others, and this person was outside of the group. He wasn't one of them. And so they tried to stop him, and they complained to Jesus about him. You know, was it more about jealousy and competitiveness than really concern over the individual's actions? And as Jesus points out, he was doing good. He was doing exactly what he wants the disciples to do, to go out and spread the goodness and the love that he came to share. But the disciples struggled with that. They identified with being Jesus' only disciples. Room for others challenged that identity, unless they came in through the right doors, I suppose. We see such behavior all the time in so many arenas of life, don't we? Comparisons, judgment, competitiveness, a my way or the highway attitude that attempts to diminish compromise and working together. There is way too much of that these days. I think you would agree. Not that it hasn't existed in the past, but it has been given greater acceptability in recent years, allowing for lines to be drawn in the sand. There seems to be more time spent pointing the finger at others and their actions than looking within at self. Behind such thoughts and behavior is, I believe, a deep lack of awareness of personal self-worth. Those who judge do so because of something greater within themselves that makes them feel devalued, so that they have to put others down and judge others in order to lift themselves up and make themselves feel better. Those who compare are acting out of a lack of self-confidence. Those who point the finger are merely protecting their own insecurities. In contrast, when we accept the love that has been given to every one of us, when we receive the gift of compassion and caring and allow that to be the driving force of our lives, the center of our being from which we act, then we will recognize a self-confidence within that does not find worth in measuring against another person, but rather demonstrates love and fairness, peace and harmony. That is who we are called to be. Writer David Luce who has written, studied this passage and written some comments on it. He suggests that the disciples had decided who they were, and they defined themselves over and against this other individual. Yet the invitation you see that Jesus offers in his refuting their insecurity is that they discovered their identity in their attempt to follow Jesus, to care for the vulnerable, to avoid those things that are destructive to self, to neighbor, to community. And in other words, live with the openness of love that Jesus had been teaching them, as opposed to setting limits on how far-reaching that love is meant to be. Jesus goes on to caution about being a stumbling block for others, being a roadblock and attention diverter that does not teach the ways of love, but rather with a competitive spirit takes away from unity and harmony. There are times when competition is fun and okay, like sailing and sports. But when we are leading people down another path, when we are competitive against them, against us, we lose our way. Jesus had just gotten done in a passage just previous to this, when the disciples were arguing over who was the greatest. And he challenged them on that. And yet there they are back at it again, acting in a way that made them feel better than this individual who's out doing good works. Their actions and their words were ego-driven. And Jesus makes it pretty clear in that really harsh, those harsh verses. He makes it clear that ego has no place in the ways of love that he gave his life to teach us about. Ego has no place, and yet ego is a great challenge for every single one of us. Being true to ourselves and what we believe is one of the greatest challenges that we all face. There are always things coming in to challenge that for us. Who we truly are is what we discover and develop within as we identify with the gift of spirit, the gift of love that dwells within each of us. You've heard me say that many times. Our true identity is that. It's a gift. It's not something that we get to attain from outside of ourselves, but the gift of God's love made real in each and every one of us. The well-known passage from John 3:16 that many of us can recite, for God so loved the world that he gave us his only son, and he gave us Jesus, and that was to teach us that we are loved, that we are each gifts, that we are treasured, and that we are cherished. Such is our true identity, every single person here. And how we internalize that truth is what shapes our living. It takes confidence in who we are, secure in our own skin, having a deep sense of contentment in our personal identity as ones who live by the ways of love put forth by our faith. Content to be living what we believe and not having to measure up to someone else or believe that they should measure up to us. Our true identity is our personal relationship with the holy, the divine, our God. The challenge comes with being in the world, but not of it, as Jesus once said. The happenings in our world ought not cause us to venture off the path of love and justice, of compassion and peace, that are at the very core of who we are. But rather, the negativity we witness in our world provides opportunity to counteract with all the goodness that we can possess. Let me share with you a story A few years back, I had picked up a book entitled Anti-Cancer, A New Way of Life, written by David Servan Schreiber. The book is about his own encounter with a brain tumor at 30 years old, and his consequent research into the area of cancer and what, if any, controls we have over the growth of cancer in our own bodies. It is a fascinating, very eye-opening book, and I recommend it. But when he first began this new journey in his life, he had just recently been divorced. He was a workaholic, and as a clinical professor of psychology with an MD and a PhD, he put very little trust in matters of faith. Up until his cancer, he was a young upstart in the field of psychology with some new techniques and discoveries that he had worked on, and gave little to much of anything else in his life except himself and this glory ride he was on. Sailing ahead of colleagues, he had a road set out before him, and he was definitely very ego-driven in that. Now, he was going to make it big, and he knew that. But then came the diagnosis when he and a colleague were doing research and used him as the guinea pig, if you will, and discovered this tumor. Well, at that same time, he had met a young woman who he began to see regularly. And he noticed at some point these books that were on her shelf about faith and religion. And he flippantly said to her, "What do you see with all of this religious nonsense? It's worthless and futile." And her answer came, "Someday you will see for yourself." Well, it turns out that he tells a story about meeting a young man who had cancer. He was in his 20s or early 30s, and he had a brain tumor himself, and he was angry and acting out, and as a psychologist, he would sit there with him. He sat next to him in a counseling session and listened, and the man's story began to unfold about his parents and heartaches in his life and personal struggles, and he wept bitterly. And after a while, Schreiber said, "I don't know what I can offer you, except that if it helps, I'm willing to meet with you every week." And he did. And at one point when he met with the man explained, he said, "I wish, facing the end of his life, knowing it wasn't that far away, he said, I wish I had done something positive with my life." And Schreiber challenged him. He said, "Well, think about that, and when you go back home, think about what it is that you might do." And so he came back the week later, and he had realized that the local church was in desperate need of air conditioning. They must have been from the South. It was desperate need of air conditioning, and that's a skill he had. And so he went to the church, and he offered to put this air conditioning in. And the church willingly accepted his offer. And he began to work on it, and some days he was slower than others because of his diagnosis and his health, and sometimes he was more tired. But ultimately, the job got done. And the church members were very accustomed to seeing him working there. Sometimes they waved and chatted. They would bring food for lunch for him. They began a relationship, and he began to feel a sense of worth. Well, several months later, the young man, weakened by this growing tumor, lay dying in the hospital. And Schreiber decided to go in and sit on his bedside and sit with him for a while and say goodbye. The young man tried to talk, but he couldn't really, he didn't have the strength. And he signaled for Schreiber to come closer, and so Schreiber put his ear to the man's mouth. And this is what he said. The dying man whispered, "Thank you for giving me life." Thank you for giving me life. Schreiber's girlfriend's comment, "Someday you'll see for yourself," became a reality in that moment. That is what it means to be salt of the earth. That is what our identity ought to be. Showing love and compassion, being a friend and caring, offering peace and hope, giving life. In closing, David Lewis, who I mentioned a little bit ago, referenced him. He says, the cross was not the vehicle by which Jesus made it possible for God to love us, but rather was God's message through Jesus that we were and are loved all along. Blessings and peace. Amen.